There is a number that updates every single second, and almost no one is watching it. It sits on screens in Washington, in trading desks in New York, in finance ministries on the other side of the world. It climbs while you sleep. It climbs while you work. By the time you finish watching this, it will have grown by more than most people earn in a lifetime. And for decades, the honest answer to the question, does this matter, was something strange and almost reassuring. The answer was, not yet. That word, yet, has done an enormous amount of work for a very long time. It has carried entire careers, entire political eras, entire generations of comfortable assumptions. The debt grows, and someone says it's a problem, and someone else says not yet. And the years pass, and nothing breaks. And the people who warned about it look foolish, and the people who ignored it look wise. This has happened so many times that most of us have learned to tune the whole subject out. We've heard the alarm so often that the alarm itself became background noise. But here's the thing that almost no one is saying clearly. The reason the debt never seemed to matter wasn't that it was harmless. It was that it existed inside a particular phase, a phase with specific rules, specific cushions, and specific escape hatches. And the quiet, deeply uncomfortable possibility is that we have left that phase, not because of a crash, not because of a single dramatic day, but because the debt has slowly changed into something that behaves differently than it used to. The number is still growing. That's the part everyone sees. What almost no one sees is that the nature of the thing has changed underneath the number. This is not a story about collapse. I want to be careful about that from the very beginning, because the loudest voices in this conversation are almost always selling fear. And fear is a poor lens for understanding anything complicated. This is a story about a threshold, about the difference between a problem that the system manages and a problem that begins to manage the system. And to understand why that distinction matters, we have to go back and understand what the old phase actually was, because we lived inside it so completely that we mistook it for the permanent state of the world. For most of the period that shaped how we think about national debt, America borrowed inside an environment that was almost magically forgiving. Think about what a government actually needs in order to carry a large debt comfortably. It needs people willing to lend to it. It needs the cost of borrowing to stay low. It needs an economy that grows faster than the debt over time. And it needs the freedom to manage the value of its own money. For a long stretch of modern history, the United States had all four of those things at once, and it had them so reliably that they faded into the background the way you stop noticing the floor you're standing on. Lenders weren't just willing to buy American debt. They were eager. Treasury bonds were treated as the closest thing the financial world had to a risk-free asset, the bedrock that everything else was priced against. When the world got scared, money didn't flee America. It ran toward it. The cost of borrowing, for years, sat at levels that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations, at one point remarkably close to nothing. And the economy, for all its troubles, generally grew. Growth is the quiet hero of every debt story, because a debt that stays the same size while the economy around it doubles becomes, in relative terms, half as heavy without anyone paying a cent. Inside that phase, the debt could grow almost indefinitely and still feel weightless. The interest was cheap, the buyers were plentiful, the economy outran the burden. And so a peculiar wisdom took hold, repeated by serious people in serious places. Deficits don't matter the way you think they do. Debt is just money we owe ourselves. A country that prints its own currency can't go broke the way a household can. And the remarkable thing is that, inside that phase, these statements were largely true. That's what made them so dangerous. They weren't lies. They were truths, with an expiration date that no one had bothered to read, because every one of those comforting facts depended on the conditions of the phase staying exactly as they were. And conditions, in economics as in nature, do not stay the same forever. They drift, they accumulate, and then one day you look up and the river you've been swimming in is flowing in a different direction, and you can't point to the exact moment it turned. So what changed? This is where the story stops being comfortable, and I want to walk through it slowly, because the shift is not the kind of thing that fits in a headline. It happened across several dimensions at once, and no single one of them would have mattered alone. It's the combination that moved us into new territory. Start with the cost of borrowing, because it sits at the center of everything. For years, the government refinanced its enormous debt at interest rates so low that the cost of carrying it stayed almost trivial relative to the size of the economy. You could owe an astonishing amount and still pay very little to service it, the way a low enough interest rate makes even a large mortgage feel manageable. But interest rates rose sharply after a long period at the floor, and here is the part that most people miss. Government debt is not borrowed once and held forever. It is constantly maturing and being rolled over, re-borrowed at whatever the going rate happens to be. So when rates rise, the old cheap debt doesn't stay cheap. It gradually gets replaced by expensive debt year after year, like a household that took out its mortgage in a golden era, slowly being forced to refinance at today's rates. And as that happens, something crosses a line that is easy to state and hard to overstate. The interest on the debt, the cost of simply owing what we already owe before a single new thing is paid for, becomes one of the largest single expenses the country has. Not a footnote, not a rounding error. One of the biggest line items in the entire budget, rivaling or exceeding things we think of as the core functions of government. Money that buys nothing, builds nothing, defends nothing, helps no one. It is the price of the past, paid in the present, growing in the future. Sit with that, because it's the quiet heart of the whole shift. In the old phase, interest was the small toll you paid for the privilege of borrowing. In the new phase, interest becomes a force of its own, because when you have to borrow money just to pay the interest on the money you already borrowed, you have entered a different kind of arithmetic. The debt begins to feed itself. It generates its own gravity. And that is the precise difference between a debt that is getting bigger and a debt that is entering a different phase. One is a number, the other is a process. But the cost of borrowing is only the first layer. And if I stopped here, I'd be telling you a story that's far too simple. Because the deeper change isn't just in the price of the debt. It's in who is willing to hold it and why. Remember that in the old phase, the world was eager to lend to America. That eagerness was never charity. It was self-interest. Foreign governments, central banks, and institutions held American debt because it was safe, because it was liquid, because the dollar sat at the center of global trade, and because, frankly, there was no better alternative. When you have enormous reserves to park somewhere, you want the safest, deepest, most trusted harbor in the world. And for decades, that harbor was unmistakably American. That hasn't reversed overnight, and anyone who tells you it has is exaggerating to frighten you. The dollar remains central. American debt remains, for now, the deepest and most trusted market on earth. But the texture of that demand has been quietly changing. Some of the largest traditional buyers have been buying less, or holding steady while the supply of new debt explodes around them. And here's the subtle, important point. You don't need a dramatic exit to change the phase. You only need the balance of eagerness to shift. In the old phase, the world was pulling debt out of America's hands faster than it could issue it. In the new phase, America increasingly has to work to find buyers, to make the debt attractive enough, priced right enough, yielding enough to clear the enormous volume it needs to sell. That is a profound reversal of posture, even if it never makes a headline. It's the difference between a popular restaurant with a line out the door and a restaurant that's still good, still respected, but now has to advertise. The food didn't get worse. The line got shorter. And when the line gets shorter, prices have to adjust to bring people in, which, in the world of debt, means higher interest rates, which means higher costs, which feeds right back into the self-reinforcing process we just described. So now you can start to see the shape of the new phase forming. Higher borrowing costs make the debt more expensive. A more crowded, less eager market for that debt pushes borrowing costs higher still. And the more the interest bill grows, the more the government has to borrow just to stand still, which means issuing even more debt into a market that's already being asked to absorb more than ever before. Each piece pushes on the others. This is what it means for a system to enter a different state. It's not that any single dial has moved to a catastrophic setting. It's that the dials have started turning each other. And I want to pause here and add the nuance that the fearmongers always skip, because this is exactly the moment where most explanations go wrong. None of this means a crash is coming on a particular date. It doesn't mean the dollar is about to lose its place in the world. It doesn't mean your savings are about to vanish. The United States retains enormous strengths, the largest economy, the deepest markets, the world's primary reserve currency, and the ability to manage its own money in ways most countries can only dream of. These are not small things. They are the reason the old phase lasted as long as it did, and they are the reason the new phase will likely unfold slowly rather than violently. The real danger here is not a sudden explosion. The real danger is something more subtle and, in its own way, more consequential. It's the slow narrowing of choices. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it's the most important idea in this entire story. In the old phase, the debt gave the country freedom. When a crisis hit, a financial collapse, a pandemic, a war, the government could borrow enormous sums quickly and cheaply, spend its way through the emergency and worry about the bill later. That capacity to respond was one of the great hidden powers of a wealthy nation with trusted credit. Debt wasn't just a burden. It was a tool. It was optionality. It was the ability to say yes when the moment demanded. In the new phase, that freedom begins to erode, quietly, from the inside. When interest payments consume an ever larger share of the budget, there is less room for everything else. Not because anyone voted to cut it, but because the math leaves less behind. When the cost of borrowing is high, the next crisis becomes more expensive to fight. When the market is already absorbing record amounts of debt, the room to issue dramatically more in an emergency gets tighter. And so, without any single decision, without any vote, without any announcement, the country's range of options begins to shrink. The debt stops being a tool the government wields and starts becoming a constraint the government serves. That is the deepest meaning of the different phase. It's not about a number on a screen. It's about a transfer of power from the people who are supposed to steer the system to the accumulated weight of the system itself. And it happens so gradually that there's never a single day you can point to and say, this is when it changed. You can only notice, after the fact, that the steering wheel has gotten heavier. There's something almost human about this pattern, and I think it's why so many of us feel an instinctive unease about debt, even when we can't articulate why. We've all known the experience, or watched someone we love live it. In the beginning, borrowing feels like freedom. It expands what you can do. It lets you reach for things you couldn't otherwise afford. The payments are small, the future is far away, and the whole arrangement feels like a clever trick you've pulled on time itself. And for a while, it is. But there's a quiet threshold in any borrowed life, a point where the relationship inverts, where you're no longer using the debt to build the life you want. You're arranging your life around the debt, working the job you don't love because you can't afford the gap, saying no to the thing you actually want because the payment is due. The money you borrowed to gain freedom has, somewhere along the way, become the thing that defines the shape of your days. Nations are not households, and I'll come back to why that distinction matters enormously, because people abuse it in both directions. But the psychological shape of the threshold is the same. There is a phase where debt is a servant, and a phase where it becomes a quiet master. And the dangerous truth is that the transition between them feels like nothing at all while it's happening. There's no alarm, no single bad day, just a slow tightening. You only recognize once you're already inside it. Now let me return to that crucial difference between a country and a household, because this is where the conversation usually splits into two camps that both get it wrong. One camp says a country is exactly like a family. It must balance its budget, live within its means, and any debt is a moral failure waiting to punish us. That's wrong, and it's the reason their warnings have been discredited for decades. A country that issues its own currency, controls its own central bank, and sits at the center of the global financial system has tools no family will ever have. It does not have to pay off its debt the way you pay off a car loan. It can roll it over indefinitely, grow the economy around it, and manage its own money in ways that would be impossible for any individual. But the other camp takes that truth and stretches it into something false. They say that because a country can't go broke the way a family can. Debt simply doesn't matter. That we can borrow without limit. That the numbers are an illusion. That anyone who worries is just confused. And that's wrong too, in a more sophisticated and more dangerous way. The constraint on a country like the United States was never that it would suddenly be unable to pay. The constraint is everything that happens on the road to that impossible cliff. It's the cost. It's the crowding out of other priorities. It's the erosion of options. It's the slow shift in who holds the debt and on what terms. It's the loss of the cushion you rely on when the next emergency arrives. The cliff was always a myth, but the slope is very real, and the slope is exactly what a different phase looks like. So, the truth lives in the uncomfortable space between the two camps, which is precisely why almost no one talks about it clearly. The doomsayers are too loud and too wrong to trust. The dismissers are too comfortable and too convenient to challenge. And in between them is the actual situation, which is neither a coming apocalypse nor a non-issue, but a genuine change in the character of the system. A change that doesn't announce itself and doesn't fit neatly into either side's story. Here's what makes this moment genuinely different from all the previous times the alarm went off and nothing happened. Every previous warning was issued from inside the old phase when the cushions were still intact. The debt was big, yes, but borrowing was cheap, buyers were eager, and the economy outran the burden. The people who said not yet were right, over and over, because the conditions of the old phase made them right. The mistake was in believing that being right about the past meant being right about the future, that because the cushions had always been there, they always would be. But cushions are not laws of nature. They were specific conditions, and conditions change. The danger now isn't that the alarm is finally ringing louder. It's that the room it's ringing in has quietly changed shape, and the old reasons it never mattered are precisely the reasons that are eroding. And this is where it stops being an abstraction about Washington and trillions and starts touching the actual texture of ordinary life. Because it does, just not in the dramatic way the fear merchants promise. You will not wake up one morning to find the system gone. That's not how slopes work. Instead, the new phase shows up in quieter forms. It shows up in the cost of borrowing for everyone, because the interest rate the government pays sets the floor under what you pay for a mortgage, a car, a business loan. When the government has to offer more to attract lenders, that pressure ripples outward into every loan in the economy. It shows up in the persistent question of inflation, because one of the oldest ways a government lightens the real weight of its debt is by allowing the value of money to drift downward over time, which quietly transfers the cost from the borrower to everyone holding savings, everyone on a fixed income, everyone whose paycheck doesn't quite keep pace. And it shows up, most importantly, in what doesn't happen. In the investments not made, the crises met with a thinner response, the choices foreclosed before anyone got to vote on them. The cost of a different phase is rarely a single visible disaster. It's 1,000 quiet absences. The road not built. The program stretched thin. The emergency met with less than it needed. The future arriving with fewer auctions than the past was handed. These are the real consequences, and they are easy to miss precisely because they take the form of things that simply fail to occur. I keep coming back to that word from the beginning. Yet. For so long, the honest answer to does this matter was not yet. And the people who said it weren't fools. They were describing the phase they lived in accurately. But not yet is a statement about timing, and timing is exactly the thing that changes when a system crosses a threshold. The most dangerous moment in any long-running situation is not when the warnings are loudest. It's when the warnings have been wrong so many times that everyone has agreed to stop listening, and the underlying conditions have quietly changed in a way that makes them right at last. Not because the boy finally cried wolf with enough conviction, but because, after all those false alarms, a wolf actually wandered into the field while everyone's back was turned. I don't know exactly how this phase unfolds. No one does, and you should be deeply skeptical of anyone who claims to. Whether the path ahead is managed gracefully through a long, slow adjustment, or whether it's handled badly through denial and delay until the choices become harsh. That part is not written yet. It depends on decisions that haven't been made by people who haven't fully reckoned with the fact that the phase has changed. There is no fixed date on this. There is no inevitable catastrophe. The future of a system this large and this resilient is genuinely open, and that openness is both the comfort and the warning. But here is what I'm confident of, and it's the one thing I'd ask you to carry away from all of this. The most important thing to understand about America's debt is no longer the size of the number. We've been hypnotized by the size for so long that we trained ourselves to either panic at it or shrug it off, and both reactions miss the point. The number was never the real story. The real story is the change in its nature, the shift from a debt that the system comfortably managed to a debt that has begun, slowly and quietly, to manage the system. From a tool that created freedom to a force that narrows it. From a problem we could always defer to a process that no longer waits for permission. A bigger number is just more of the same thing. A different phase is a different thing entirely. And the reason this matters, the reason it's worth understanding, even though it won't show up as a headline on any particular morning, is that the phases of a system are invisible while you're inside them and obvious only in hindsight. We are living through the kind of change that historians will one day describe in a single clean sentence. The way they described the moment an empire's finances turned, or a currency's role began to fade. They make it sound like an event with a date, but we who are living through it know the truth, which is that it doesn't feel like an event at all. It feels like an ordinary Tuesday. It feels like a number ticking upward on a screen that almost no one is watching. It feels like nothing, right up until the moment you look up and realize the river is flowing in a different direction, and you can't say exactly when it turned. That number is still climbing as you watch this. It will keep climbing as you watch this. It will keep climbing after. And the question that actually matters is no longer how high it goes. It's whether we understand, finally, that we're not just watching something get bigger, we're watching it become something else. The phase has changed. The only thing still undecided is whether we'll admit it in time to do anything about it, or whether, like every generation that mistook its cushions for the permanent shape of the world, we'll keep saying, not yet, right up until the day that word finally runs out. If you want to help break the cycle of comfortable denial, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Sharing this video is the fastest way to get people talking about what's actually happening underneath the numbers.